Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of January 12th, and this is your Monday briefing.
So, Scott, we're only into day 12 of 2026, and the activity and energy out of Washington is fervent, to say the least. But let's talk about what's happening this week.
Sure, just to keep it as manageable as we can. So Congress's main goal for this month is to try to get ahead of the January 30th funding deadline. To do that, the House passed some appropriations bills last week that the Senate will take up this week. So it's a 3-bill package that the Senate will be working on. Meanwhile, the House will be working on some additional appropriations packages that presumably they will try to get done this week and maybe send over to the Senate. Now, thinking of that January 30th deadline, if they can get done some of these appropriations bills, that will make it a lot easier to deal with the January 30th deadline, because whatever they can't get done through what is known as regular order, this passage of appropriations bills, could presumably be wrapped up in one big continuing resolution, or CR. So that seems to be the most likely outcome, and certainly the most hopeful to prevent another government shutdown. But at the same time, the days are ticking. We need to watch that sand through the hourglass to make sure that they're still on track. So that's the main focus of activity for this week. But the House is actually still busy as well. They're going to be working on a couple of trade issues. So one is that they will take up votes on the House floor to extend some trade preference programs, including AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and some trade preferences for Haiti. Meanwhile, from a Ways and Means perspective, which we all care about here, the Trade Subcommittee of Ways and Means is going to be holding a hearing on U.S. trade policy and how it can help with U.S.-based innovation and U.S.-based technology. And then outside of the trade world for a second, we've got two other issues to note. One is that the IRS announced that it will open its tax filing season for 2026 on January 26th. And then President Trump was invited to deliver his State of the Union address to Congress on February 24th. So we just got that news as well.
Excellent. And we have that on our calendars to cover. So you mentioned trade earlier. Speaking of trade, we were expecting the IEEPA decision from the Supreme Court last week. It did not materialize, and now we're hearing that it might be this week. But we did have a chance to get Desmond and Mark Truchan into the studio to have a discussion about various scenarios and best practices for companies. So let's take a look at that.
Mark, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in. We were expecting some news last week from the Supreme Court on the legality of the IEEPA tariffs. We didn't get that, but we might get it as early as Wednesday or sometime in the near future. What do you think the potential outcomes could be?
Thanks, Chris. There's a few possible outcomes. So the Supreme Court could fully affirm IEEPA as a basis for tariffs, essentially preserving the tariffs that have been implemented with no possibility for refunds. That outcome is probably unlikely at this point. There's also the possibility that the Supreme Court could impose some procedural or substantive limits on IEEPA, so we might expect to see some type of mixed or split outcome. So the Supreme Court could sustain only those tariffs it determines to be genuinely tied to a true national emergency. So it could keep the fentanyl-driven tariffs in place on China, Canada, and Mexico, while striking down the broader reciprocal tariffs. It's also possible that the Supreme Court fully denies IEEPA tariff authority, opening up the door fully for refunds for importers.
So let's pretend, fast forward, the Supreme Court gives its ruling and there's a full or partial denial. And then there's a question of the word refunds and cash, and CFOs get all excited about that. Companies are saying, show me the money. What money can be shown, if any, at that point in time?
Sure. Well, first off, it's about $133 billion in tariffs that's potentially on the table for refunds. That's from the latest statistics by U.S. Customs. The big challenge, though, is what's the procedural process going to look like? Nobody actually knows. It could be sent to the lower courts to decide what that process looks like. It could go back to Customs. In our TPO report that we actually recently issued this week, we actually laid out several of the different mechanisms that importers might expect to see. It could follow the traditional processes of PSCs and protests, but we just don't know.
So let's take the example of this does happen. There is a process. But companies are saying, do we just wait and see what happens? Or are there things, because you're talking with companies all the time, like what would be some best practice tips you would say right now, these are the things I'd be doing if I were in your shoes?
Sure. I mean, I think number one is model the outcomes, right? Just because you paid tariffs does not mean all of those tariffs are potentially eligible for refunds.
When you mean outcomes, is it going to be out for IEEPA tariffs themselves? Like, what do you mean? There's different layers of IEEPA tariffs?
Correct. There's different layers of IEEPA tariffs. There's the fentanyl trafficking-driven IEEPA tariffs on China, Canada, Mexico, and then we have the broader reciprocal tariffs.
Got it.
We also have some additional IEEPA tariffs that have been implemented, but those are the key three buckets. So when we say that there's refunds potentially available, we don't know exactly which refunds they could be on exactly which segment. So first off, I think companies need to model out what those different options look like, so they have a better sense as to what's on the table. And second would be then gathering all the documentation to support the potential refund process. That's likely going to take some time.
And so from a CFO lens perspective, they're going to be anxious to kind of claim the benefit. Like, is there any guardrails you give around that from the timing of, let's say there is a partial or full refund that is due? From a CFO lens, how would you talk to a CFO?
Timing is a big unknown here. Traditional refund processes with customs could take years. That's in a normal environment, right? Right now, we're looking at a massive amount of refunds that potentially would be on the table. We don't know what that process is going to look like, given government constraints.
Last question for you, Mark. So if there is that process, where are the bottlenecks you see in the refund process?
I think the biggest bottlenecks, there's really two, and it's really on the execution side. It's the execution side in-house within a company, because teams are already stretched thin.
Yeah.
They're managing day-to-day filings of entries. They're trying to manage different tariff programs they're implementing. Now they're going to be asked to try and actually support a giant refund process. Teams have very limited resources. So I think that's one constraint companies need to anticipate. Second is, even if you have all of that documentation ready to go, which is a plus, brokers are also going to be under massive constraints. Yeah. Everyone is going to be flooding to try and get refunds as quickly as possible. And so that's going to be a big amount of pressure in the system. And the third constraint is also CBP itself. Even if a process is outlined, the administrative volume to process those refunds could take a significant amount of time. Again, so going back to your question around timing, it's a big unknown. I would proceed cautiously in terms of expecting those refunds.
Mark, those are great points, great insights. It's great to catch up with you.
You too. Thanks, Chris.
And a note for our viewers, PwC will be hosting a webcast on Tuesday, January 13th, to discuss the side-by-side system and its potential impact on multinational entities and their upcoming compliance obligations. A link to register for that webcast is in the show notes.
And along with that, you'll find a link to PwC's 2026 Tax Policy Outlook. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. Take care and have a good week.